This oral history of museum computing is provided by Marla Misunas and was recorded on the 22nd of February 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Um, in my many years of working in museum computing, the issue of invisible work and workers has come up a number of times because, everybody wants to have sexy exhibitions and sexy new accessions. And most people don't realize all of the work that goes on. And so it's really hard to get funding for things like, um, new systems and putting systems together in a network and upgrading the network and even, original data entry. So that comes up in the department I'm in, which is called Collections Information and Access. And then that department is in the Collections, Exhibitions, and Design Division. It's sort of a new reorganization. And we have talked pretty regularly, but always in the abstract, about how to show, the kind of work that we're doing. Because like I said, exhibitions and accessions are pretty visible, but all the stuff that goes into making it possible for them to be visible is not so well known. And so I have two stories that I wanted to tell, and probably lots more after that or in between. But I when I was thinking about this yesterday and trying to put together some notes and thinking, no, I don't have anything to say, I realized, oh yeah, I actually have a lot to say. Um, so, so the first story has to do with um, when I first started at SF MoMA in 1992. They had a database which was, a collections database, or something that they called a collections database, which was kind of an offshoot and built on top of the financial system, which was in DOS. And, at that time too, there were still punch cards and, stuff like that. And that DOS system was actually a really large doorstop at the time. Nobody knew how to use it. It was completely dead. It wasn't updated or anything like that. And so the museum administration wanted the registrar's office, where I was at the time, to come up with a recommendation for a system that would track the museum's finances, membership, donors, contributions, the art collection, and oh yeah, attendance too. And so yeah, so we spent some time looking for that magical unicorn system. And guess what? We never found it. And there still isn't one. So we worked with the company that became Gallery Systems. We were one of something like 20 museum partners that worked with them to create the best museum system that included images, which was hugely innovative at the time. So early 90s was when we were doing that. And we moved our collection out of the building we were in 1992, which we had been in since 1935-ish. So we were moving out to a new building that we had built, and we had to move everything out in 1994, but the database wasn't ready yet. So we, had something cobbled together that we could use for data movements and inventory and that sort of stuff. And I backed that system up onto my own desktop computer every night, which was similar to what people were doing at that time. As I had previously worked at another museum where the head registrar physically took her computer with the disk and the hard drive, etc., home in her car every weekend. to make sure that it stays safe. So, you know, we were in this other job, we were in a building that wasn't terribly earthquake safe. Um, so, you know, it was timely for sure because we had just had a big earthquake in the Bay Area. And so anyway, so that was pretty much par for the course. It sounds really weird now, but that was, you know, that was what you did. So we had just like the kernel of this database with the locations and the, you know, bare bones object information. And that was put together out of a whole bunch of different departments, FileMaker databases. And you can imagine what, you know, what that was like. Everybody had their own set of records, and that also meant that they could alter their own records without bothering anybody else's records, which is good sometimes, but usually it's bad for data integrity. And, you know, so the publications department wanted to put something out like an annual report, and they would ask the director's office, they would also ask curator A, and then curator B, and then curator C, and then curator D. And then, oh, well, let's ask registration too. And everybody had slightly different titles, slightly different credit lines, you know. So we really needed a centralized database, and we did eventually, you know, once we moved in, we did get on the road to doing that. But what happened before we got there was we had roughly 15,000 things in the collection. And so all of our records were on paper, naturally, except for the weird variety of things on, which was a very small set of fields on FileMaker. So 15,000 things in the collection translated to 15,000 object files, or in our case, hundreds and hundreds of binders that had, you know, all the records for each object in the binders. And so we knew that we didn't have the staff to input all that stuff into our new system, and PS, the new system wasn't ready. So and when I say we, I don't mean me because I was not involved in this particular decision. But the museum decided the way to get this done was to have a service microfilm all of the binders. So hundreds and hundreds of binders. And then they would box up the microfilm in crates and send it to a company in Australia that had won the project, being the lowest bidder, right? Because that's what we museums would often do, especially then, was to get whatever the cheapest thing was to satisfy probably the board and the finance committee and that sort of thing. Most of us knowing full well that the cheapest thing might not be the best thing. So, to make a long story short, what happened was the company went bankrupt in the middle of our project. So, we had crates and crates of microfilm in Australia where probably most of the records had been entered on a first pass into whatever system it was, probably FileMaker, I don't remember. And also people for whom art terms and art kinds of records were not something they were familiar with. And so added to that, just a little more seasoning, was that a lot of our records were handwritten, and handwritten by various people over various times, people who were in a hurry and didn't have the best handwriting to begin with. So there was a lot of interpretation. Even you wouldn't think that there would be, but there was a lot of interpretation. And we, you know, we were desperate to get the stuff, and we also knew it was going to take a long time to clean up. So it took a full year to clean up everything. And it was me and some volunteers who were not super happy about having, you know, realizing what they signed up for, but it did eventually did eventually happen, and the records got in to the database, but it took a long time, and it took another long time to get the different departments, curatorial and registration and conservation and exhibitions, to not only trust the data but actually use the database. So that was a probably at least 5-year rollout. And what eventually happened was, and I'm sorry to say this is still kind of true, not everybody used it. Not people. Some people did not think it was reliable, and certainly they had good reason for that. But it's also it feels like you're criticizing my child when you say something like that. so so I had to learn not to take it personally, and that took me a long time. But the thing is that, whoever is spearheading the project is going to be the person that gets all the blame for whatever is wrong, regardless of whether it's the data or the functionality or, their desktop not behaving itself. Um, so that's one of those things. But let's see. Ooh, I have another story.
And ask a quick follow-up question. So in
Yeah.
that time period, then you've got people modifying paper records and the database records at the same time, so they're diverging.
Yeah. But to be realistic, the paper records didn't really get changed that much because the data just didn't change that much. Yeah, and now we've gone from um, the digital records being the ones that are the most up to date, and that people sometimes forget to update the paper records. So um, comparing the two is one of the processes that we do before we put things online. And depending on how new things are, there's pretty much nothing in the paper files. So um, for those things, it can be faster. But what I was going to say, and then forgot and remembered, was that there are people who in the institution who won't use the database anyway, no matter what you tell them or how many times you train them. And so okay, that's that. A nice thing about our EMPs is that current and most and fairly recent, in the last 10 years ish, museum studies students know how to use databases. And so gradually, as these new professionals were filtering into the system, it was like, well, of course you use the database. Wow, how else would you do your job? And so gradually the non-adopters were replaced by mostly adopters. But we, of course, we had at least one new director that wanted the entire database on paper shipped to his home, and we did it.
That
But
actually,
that was,
you made a neuron fire in my head. When I was a doctoral student at University of Illinois working at the museum there, we had a professor, I forget, I want to say anthropology maybe, come to the museum to look at something, and I showed her how to pull up the records on the database, and she looked like I had slapped her, and she said, I didn't get a PhD to type on the computer, and she made me print them out. I was like, okay. Like, all right then.
uh-huh, uh-huh. I'll just wait till I have my PhD.
That's right.
Wow.
But be
Yeah.
particular, yes, right.
Yes. Yeah. Also, another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the way that various projects kind of push things along for us in some ways, and kind of modernized us a bit. And SFM was part of the MESL project, Museum Educational Site Licensing. And then we were part of the AMICO project, Art Museum Image Consortium. And at the same time, so that was like late 90s, early 2000s. Um, at the same time, museums were just barely starting to get their websites online. Most people didn't have online collections. Um, but kind of on a parallel track, you had museum trustees who were looking at other museum databases and wanting, something similar from whatever museum they were working with. And then as soon as those museums started putting their collections online, then, our trustees wanted to see our collections online, especially the things with their names in the credit line, which, I totally get that. I would be there too. Um, and so we, so that took a number of years to get the records, not necessarily in, fixed up because we have been doing that already, but to a point where the people who weren't fixing them up were comfortable with the standards and the fixed upness of the things that we were going to be publishing whenever we got to that point, which we weren't at yet. And then to say nothing of the images, um, which of course, for a modern art collection, the number of images that you don't hold the copyright to far outweighs the ones where you can claim public domain or something like that. And so we knew that was an issue, especially with the internet and suddenly people knowing that somebody published their image even though they didn't get a letter in the mail about it. Suddenly it was much easier to find things if they were there to be found. And so we had to start paying more attention to asking people if we could publish their images online. And again, it was sort of, I hate to say it, being in the older crowd myself now, but the a lot of the older artists didn't want their images of their work to be published because they thought it would cheapen their artwork and make the actual object less impressive, um, which of course isn't true, and we know that. We have a lot of data on that. So it kind of links back to that old argument of, well, we can't put color plates in books because then no one wants to see the object. We also know that's not true. But that sort of stuff, that kind of attitude, was something we had to break through and get beyond. And so we were pretty excited about the Amico project because we had to submit data, but we also had to submit images. And that meant we had to scan our transparencies. Um, and in some cases, take new pictures of work because some of those old transparencies just couldn't be fixed up with, the rudimentary tools that we had at the time. So we were scanning transparencies, and then, people started to see images in the database, in our internal database, which was pretty exciting. Um, but of course, we didn't have transparencies of everything, so we didn't have images of everything. But we did have Polaroids from all of that inventory we had done before we moved into the new building. Yeah. So we started scanning Polaroids and popping those into the database. And so you would have, a beautiful picture of a Matisse painting, and then you would have a picture of something on a rack, with plastic around it in the next record. But, people really began to depend on images, and it's so much easier to find something if you know what it looks like than if all you have is the dimensions in the medium. So that became, the direction that everybody was pointed in. I mean, some less enthusiastic than others, but but that's always the case. And so at that time, with Steve on the horizon and And Amico, Amico, I think, was important in terms of its proof of concept and being a great idea um, that didn't have an exceptionally long life, but I think it really proves what could be done and how people really wanted that kind of information. And so we are publishing things to Artsy now, and they've made that really really easy, which is awesome. Um, so my team does that with some regularity, and I say team, and I really don't mean me. um, but anyways, I mean, I've done it and it's easy, and you know, artsy all the way, yay. Um, so Steve was a public crowdsourced tagging project that a lot of different museums worked with, and I know GLACMA did a lot with Steve. And unfortunately, we were never able to hook the Steve widget up to our system, but the Steve project proved that crowdsourcing tags was really helpful. And, despite the seventh graders who put in things like, I really like Jeremy, why doesn't he like me, in the tags, um, in general, the tags were really useful. And so we knew that at some point in the future, our tags would be helpful. And there was a lot of discussion about who's the audience. Are we getting our art historical experts to tag the objects, which I think plenty of museums did. But that would mean asking curatorial to do it, and curatorial had other priorities and wasn't especially interested in doing it. And so those of us who are in the collections information and access area, where I am, just knew that it would eventually be helpful to have tags that a general audience could relate to. And P.S. we weren't in curatorial, so we weren't allowed to call this expressionism or whatever ism, Uh, and so we began tagging objects with subject tags. And, we came up with some guidelines and some, just general observations about the way we did things. And we based it on the fine arts museums in San Francisco had a system, a really loosely, it wasn't structured, a loose idea about what they called word soup. And so we did try the hierarchical method, and, oh my God, that was a disaster. Everyone hated it. but the fine arts museums had been uploading their not for publication images into their database. And they actually had people take their work computers home with them and do tagging at home, which kind of goes to what we were talking about working at home in the very early part of this conversation. And so we thought, that is so great. Why, we could do that too. Well, the working at home part didn't happen, but we, as a part of reviewing the records against the paper documents, like I was talking about before, we also put in subject tags into each record that we were approving, and it would be approved for exhibition and wall labels. And then we're hoping that someday those things would also go on the website, and that people would be able to find them using the terms that we had added. And so roughly 40% of the collection is on the website now. So 40% of 50,000 is, I don't know, a bunch. And all of those records have tags that were entered by me and one other person mostly. We had help from other departments occasionally, and from volunteers and interns definitely. But so far as the steady application of effort, that came from the database team. And we uh, we started to talk about bias in our tags maybe 5 years ago or so, maybe more. And my boss, Lena White, who was the department head for collections, information, and access, and is now the division head and also the department head, um, she had this idea about bias and tags and how we should start to look at that. And the person I was working with at the time, who was the documentation associate, and I were both of a similar age range, and we were both white ladies with master's degrees in museum studies. And so we knew that there was bias on our tags for sure. Um, and just as a really minor, silly kind of example, we would tag things that we really liked. So, we tagged what was in the image, but where somebody might see a man in a suit, we would tag man and we would tag suit, but we would also tag hat and necktie and spectacles and glasses and pipe and whatever else, because we thought those details were interesting. And we also we just tag things we thought were interesting. Like, for example, I'm a dog lover, and so I always tag dogs. And then I had to go back and tag animals too. And if I knew what breed it was, I would even tag the breed, although probably nobody would ever look for that in an art museum. But you never know. So there were definitely biases, and we and where that kind of came out of the realm of just our department talking about it was when we moved out of our old new building that we had moved into in 1994. We had to move the whole collection out in 2012, 2013, put the whole thing in storage, and we had this major, major renovation of our new building so that everything came out, went into storage, was inventoried, of course. And then the storage areas in the existing building were completely redone, and new storage areas in the building were created in a bunch of different places. And we also had a brand new offsite storage building where more stuff was stored. So now our collection, which had been mostly in our building, but also in various commercial offsite storage locations, was now in our building and in primarily our own offsite storage. And there's a few things here and there in other commercial storage, and then there's fractional gifts that are in people's homes. But in general, everything was under an SF MoMA umbrella by the time we moved into our new building in 2015. And so also in 2015, there was a lot of hoopla, and we'll have to go back and make sure I got the date right, that it really was 2015 and not 2016. Anyway, so there was a lot of hoopla around the new building, and everybody was really excited, and the public, had just been hearing about it for a long time, and we were in between. We were also on the go, and we had partnered with other museums to do cool exhibitions in other places around town. And people wanted to see themselves reflected in the collections that we had online. And I don't think it's unusual that we had to change our approach as far as we did definitely change our approach in tagging with the input of visitors and people who were contacting us online, contacting us through the website. I had a very nice woman who I think also is probably in museums email me and say, I'm looking for people of color. I'm looking for images that I can show my kids of, representations of Black people in museum collections, African American people in museum collections. how do I find that in your collection? And right around that time, we also had a lot of interest in people wanting to see the collections that weren't on view in the galleries. So we had a digital technologist called Jay Malika who worked for us for a while in our web team. And he came up with this texting service called Send Me SFMOMA, which blew up the internet and was amazing and incredible, um, and was recently sunsetted, sadly. And I will go to my grave wishing that was still available. Because the awesome thing about Send Me SFMOMA was that you didn't need a computer, you just needed a phone, you needed to text, send me something to a number, and the service would go through and pull out an image, especially selected for you, haha, randomly, based on whatever word or words you entered. And so that was another big factor in us examining our keywords and needing to change them. And so this woman who had wanted to see representations of people of color in our collection also searched Send Me SFMOMA for Black people. And what she didn't know, and a lot of us didn't know, was that Send Me SFMOMA could only search for one word at a time. It couldn't search for two words put together by a space. And so when she searched for Black people on Send Me SFMOMA, she got a picture of the United Nations first meeting at our old building in the building that included the old museum in 1948, I think. So there was this conference room full of white men in Black suits. And she thought, well, that's interesting. It's not what I wanted. So that was a fail, and we needed to work on that. And we had been, especially given, the two middle-aged white lady thing, um, the museum as a practice did not distinguish between the ethnicities of people who were subjects in images. And where that fell apart was with people wanting to have access to images based on people's appearance. So, of course, we thought that's an awesome idea. We've never done that before. So we went in and we tagged people, white people, we tagged people of color. But the other white lady and I didn't feel comfortable saying this was a Black person or this was an African American person. What if it was an Afro-Cuban person? So there were a lot of uncertainties. I mean, there are people, artists out there who specifically are making pictures of African American people, and so we felt comfortable tagging those. But in general, we tag people of color. Um, but P.S. There's nothing on the website to tell you to search for that. So, we, knowing that we had some pretty imprecise tags in there, we also started to spread out. We always wanted to have more voices in that conversation than just the two ladies. But it's been really hard to get people to add tags because usually they're not the ones searching. And so, so now we're getting statistics about what people search for, and we were getting them back then too, which, helps you make the case for getting more voices, because I feel pretty qualified of saying, this person is white, but that's about it. That's where my feeling qualified stops. And I think that's reasonable. And so one of the gifts that we've had with the COVID shutdown is that we have frontline staff that are helping out on various different projects, and now they're starting to help us tag objects that are going online or already online. So, I mean, literally, they've just started working on it this week. So, I have great hopes that we can um, spread the news about doing this. I mean, everybody who has a user account is able to add tags, but most of them don't know that. And some people have added things, but again, there's a lot of sensitivity around um, what terms you're using and which things get tagged. In one of my training sessions last week, somebody asked me, what terms are you using to tag works by gay artists or members of the LGBTQ community? And we have not gone down that path yet, um, because an artist might identify as LGBTQ, but that doesn't mean that their artwork is showing an LGBTQ theme, or it could be that they think all of their artwork does or doesn't. So, so we're also working with curatorial on. We're starting with ethnicity of artists because it's not something that we typically collected, and because people are asking, where are your work by Black artists, where are your work by Asian artists, um, and because it's the right thing to do, we are starting to at least use those distinctions in our internal database. Although, we're a long way from doing something like the Smithsonian just came out with, a feature on art by Black artists. Um, yeah, like I said, we're way far away from doing that, and we would only do it if the artist agreed. Um, but in the meantime, we have to ask living artists, and we need to research artists who are no longer with us. In some cases, ULAN collects that. Um, Sometimes ULAN is wrong, and so that's iffy too. But we have something like 6,000 artists for which the ethnicity has not been recorded. And knowing what I know about my long time working with the collection, I'm gonna say most of those people are white. Um, there's definitely a good Latin American collection. There's a pretty decent Asian collection, but honestly, if you were to project that X percentage of artists was white, and then you do all the research with all those 6,000 people, you're going to be pretty doggone close. Um, your assumption, even though we hate that word and we don't like to say it, I mean, we are now doing a lot more collecting of many more diverse kinds of people than just white artists. And I'm hopeful that that continues. I mean, it's definitely in our strategic plan, and it's something that we're all working on. And so, I hope that in 10 years, the picture is much more varied than it is right now. And that said, we have a lot of work to do. And we're working with curatorial. They are coming up with a questionnaire. And, there are other sources of that data that we're also trying to hit, like Wikidata and SMU, I think, is another one. Um, as well as places like ULAN and other places. But honestly, finding a record where it says this is a white person or this is an anything else person is very difficult. We've been running test sets and things like that, trying to see if there's a place where we can get a whole bunch of matches with artists in our collections. There isn't, as far as we can find. So That's another part of, the data, the invisible data workers, is that when you find things, it's awesome. But the part of the work that happens where you don't find anything is also valid, but it's not measurable. And, you know, I can imagine funders not wanting to fund things that don't work. However, that's the way our society is right now. So we need to push it forward, and hopefully, as museums, we will be able to do that.
Well, and I love the example you're sharing about the inherent biases here and the tagging and the problems that this causes. The send me SF Momo example is fantastic. And what it reminded me of was the problem a couple of years ago with the Google Arts and Culture plugin, where you took a picture of yourself and then it matched you with a painting.
Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you. That was one of those little funny things I was going to mention. That when we were trying, we tried a bunch of different things to try and automate tagging, and we worked with Google Art Project. They had an artist in residence who had come up with an algorithm whereby you fed the computer images, and we didn't know what to do with tagging our abstract things, so we gave them like 20 pictures of abstract paintings. And so you fed these images into the computer, and it would come up with poems based on each image, which were hilarious and completely unusable and not something we would ever even put on the wall. Um, because the computer was trying to match the shapes it found in an abstract painting with an actual thing. And so we have a Rothko painting that has this kind of horseshoe shaped form in it that the computer decided was a sewing machine. And I can't see it any other way now. It's like, oh yeah, it's the one with the sewing machine, or it's the one with the fire hydrant. So that really told us that we're not really there yet, and we need to keep having humans do tagging, especially with abstract work.
Do you know
I
for
used to,
yeah.
when I had students, I used to tell my students that two things. One was, yeah, I was teaching collection management, which can be a little dry, and I used to tell them that you will get through this, and what it takes is a steady application of effort, which is definitely something I apply to my own work. And um, you have to clean the stable before they let you ride the racehorse, um, and the other thing that I wanted to impress upon them, and I still tell interns to this day, if I had one, but I don't, is that just because you learn something in school doesn't mean it's the way it's done in whatever museum you land a job in or an internship in. And I know firsthand because I went into a registration position with a little tiny collection, and was just like, oh my god, everything's a mess, and it's so terrible, and you did everything wrong, blah, 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 blah. And then I realized, much to my embarrassment, that there probably was a reason why people set things up the way they did, and that people that have been there a while might actually be able to explain um, the system. And so that's something that I try to tell people in a nice way when they tell me, "You're doing it all wrong." It's like, yeah, I know, I've been there. I have been that person.